Imagine a river that is just like so utterly choked with salmon that the water itself looks like it's boiling.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you don't need nets. You don't really even need a spear. You can practically just wade in there and scoop up enough protein in, say, 3 weeks to feed your entire extended family for a whole year.
That is, I mean, that's just an unfathomable amount of calories.
It is. And for the next 11 months, your basic survival is completely handled. Your calendar is totally blank. So what happens next?
You'd think that's the dream, right?
Exactly. Instinctively, you'd think this is the recipe for a flawless utopia. Instead, in the historical reality we're going to look at today, that exact scenario birthed one of the most rigidly unequal societies on the face of the earth, complete with a massive enslaved population.
It is just so jarring to hear.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into a scenario today that cuts right to the core of who we are as a species. Because the question is, when human beings finally solve the problem of survival, when we achieve true abundance, do we use that newfound freedom to flourish? Or do we just, invent entirely new ways to rank and restrict each other?
It is arguably the ultimate test of human nature. I mean, for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, survival was an all-consuming full-time job.
Right, there was no downtime.
None. The concept of having extra time, extra calories, extra energy, it simply didn't compute. So watching what societies do when they suddenly hit the jackpot, it provides a perfectly unvarnished look at our actual priorities.
And that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are doing a measured, essayistic reckoning of the whole concept of abundance. We've got a fascinating stack of sources to work through. We've got historical first-hand observations, economic theories that have caused centuries of debate, and some incredibly complex archaeological and genetic records that just came out in 2024.
It's a really diverse pile of evidence.
It is. And our goal is to cross-examine 5 distinct historical societies. These are cultures that achieved an energy surplus, meaning they figured out the mechanics of producing way more than they needed to survive. We're going to test 2 deeply opposed intellectual traditions against their stories. On one side, you have the belief that abundance always inevitably hits a hard physical limit and collapses.
Like the pessimists.
Yeah. And on the other side, the belief that human ingenuity constantly moves the ceiling of what's possible.
It's a debate about the fundamental architecture of human potential. Are we bound by the unyielding laws of physics and biology, or does the human mind represent this ultimate limit-breaking resource?
Exactly. And if you are listening to this right now, I want you to think about this in the context of your own life. If you've ever felt like you're running on a treadmill, chasing the next big financial milestone or the next promotion, but never actually feeling like you have enough, this deep dive is going to explain the hidden mechanics behind that exact feeling.
It's not just a modern problem.
No. We're going to show you how ancient, unfathomably wealthy societies fell into the exact same psychological traps. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to move from the abstract idea of a surplus to the concrete, dirt under the fingernails reality of what happens when a society suddenly gets massive amounts of free time.
To do that, we have to understand that a surplus is a physical, ecological event. It's the literal freeing up of human hands.
Make that real for me.
Sure. So if you spend 10 hours a day foraging for berries just to get 2,000 calories, your hands are tied. You can't do anything else. But if you spend 1 hour fishing to get 10,000 calories, you suddenly have 9 hours and your hands return to you. Our sources provide these memoir-like observations of 4 historical surplus cultures, plus a 5th that has been heavily debated.
Okay, let's start with that boiling river I mentioned at the top. We're going to the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, to the Salmon Coast. The sources describe the sheer scale of the ecological wealth available to nations like the Haida, the Tlingit, and the Kwakwaka'wakw.
The energy density of a Pacific salmon run is just staggering. You have millions of calorie-dense, fat-rich fish throwing themselves out of the ocean and up the rivers.
And it happens like clockwork, right?
Predictably, every single autumn. You don't have to clear land. You don't plant seeds. You don't weed or water or worry about locusts. The ocean essentially does all the farming for you and then literally delivers the harvest to your front door.
I'm trying to picture the logistics of this, though, because if 1 million fish show up over a 3-week period, you obviously can't eat them all at once. And a dead fish rots really fast. How do you actually capture that energy so it lasts the rest of the year?
That is the crucial technological leap. A surplus only matters if it's storable. These societies mastered the engineering of preservation. They built these massive cedar drying racks and specialized smokehouses.
So they're making jerky, basically.
Exactly. They would clean the salmon, butterfly them to maximize the surface area, and use the ambient wind and wood smoke to draw all the moisture out of the flesh. They turned millions of perishable fish into highly stable, protein-packed jerky, and they could store it in cedar boxes for months or even years without it spoiling.
Okay, so they process all the salmon, pack it away, and suddenly the whole community has the entire winter completely off. What do they do with all that time?
They convert that caloric surplus into staggering cultural capital. They didn't need to move around to find food, so they settled into these massive permanent villages. They felled giant western red cedars to build enormous longhouses. Some were big enough to hold multiple extended families.
And this is where the famous totem poles come in, right?
Yes, exactly. The totem poles are a direct physical manifestation of surplus time. I mean, carving a 50-foot cedar trunk into a complex interlocking narrative of animal spirits requires thousands of hours of highly specialized labor.
You can't have a full-time carver if everyone is starving.
Precisely. You only get master carvers if you have enough smoked salmon to feed them while they work. But it wasn't just physical art. They developed these kinetic, articulated ceremonial masks for elaborate winter dance dramas. And most importantly, they developed an economic and social institution known as the potlatch.
The potlatch is fascinating because it seems to completely invert our modern understanding of wealth. In a potlatch, a chief gains status not by hoarding their stuff, but by throwing a massive feast and giving it all away, right?
It was a complex system of redistribution and status signaling. So a chief would spend years accumulating a surplus food, woven blankets, intricately hammered copper shields, and then invite rival chiefs in neighboring villages to a multi-day event.
Like a massive party.
Right. And at the climax of the potlatch, the host would distribute all of this wealth to the guests strictly according to their rank. The more you could give away, the higher your social standing.
See, on paper, that sounds incredible. It sounds like this beautifully egalitarian way to handle abundance. You have too much, so you throw a party, make sure everyone leaves with blankets and food. But the sources point to a very dark shadow looming over this coast.
A very profound shadow. Because that very same predictable, concentrated salmon run that fed the master carvers also built one of the most rigidly stratified hierarchical societies on Earth. You had a strict caste system.
Yeah.
Hereditary nobility at the top, commoners in the middle, and a massive enslaved population at the bottom.
I have to stop you there because I don't get the economic logic of that. Usually we think of slavery emerging in, agricultural societies that desperately need cheap labor to work massive plantations just to survive.
Right, like cotton or sugar.
Yeah. But if the ocean is literally throwing food at you and survival is totally solved in 3 weeks, what is the point of enslaving up to a quarter of your population?
Because an energy surplus, at its core, is raw power. Look, when a society only produces exactly enough to survive, there's nothing to steal. And there's no one who can be freed from labor to rule over others. But the moment you have a storable, defensible surplus like thousands of boxes of smoked salmon, it invites control.
So they didn't need slaves to catch the fish.
No, the enslaved captives, who were often taken in warfare with neighboring groups, they weren't primarily there to catch the fish. They were there to process the fish, to chop the wood, to paddle the enormous war canoes, and honestly, to serve as living symbols of the nobility's wealth.
Wow. So the surplus didn't eliminate the need for harsh labor, it just shifted who had to do it.
Exactly. And the potlatch itself had a deeply coercive, violent side. It wasn't just a friendly giveaway. It was an arena for aggressive, cutthroat status competition. If a rival chief gave away 1,000 blankets, you had to throw a potlatch and give away 2,000, or you risk losing your standing.
An arms race of giving things away.
Yeah. And in extreme cases, to demonstrate absolute disdain for wealth and prove unassailable power, hosts would ritually destroy their most valuable possessions. They'd throw priceless copper shields into the fire. And, horrifically, they would sometimes kill enslaved captives purely as a display of how much property they could afford to throw away.
That is so dark. The abundance of the coast and the brutal hierarchy were inextricably linked. They came off the exact same fish. That is a heavy contradiction to hold. I mean, if the surplus is a lottery ticket, why does the prize money always seem to end up funding a caste system instead of a utopia?
Let's see if this pattern holds up as we move south. We're going to Mesoamerica, to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. This is our second witness. We are trading the salmon runs for swamp engineering.
Right, and the agricultural engineering in the Valley of Mexico is arguably the most productive pre-industrial farming system ever devised by human beings. They built what are called chinampas, often referred to as floating gardens, though they didn't actually float.
Walk me through the mechanics of a chinampa, because how do you farm in the middle of a shallow lake? You start by marking out a rectangular plot in the shallow lake bed using wooden stakes. Then you weave a fence of reeds and branches between those stakes. Inside that enclosure, you just begin piling up alternating layers of mud dredged from the bottom of the lake and decaying aquatic vegetation.
You just keep piling it up.
You keep piling this up until the artificial island rises above the waterline.
So you're basically building a giant, highly fertile compost sponge right in the middle of the water.
Precisely. And the genius of the system is the capillary action. Because the chinampa is entirely surrounded by water and the soil is porous, the water naturally wicks up into the root zone of the crops. You almost never have to manually irrigate.
That is brilliant.
And to stabilize these man-made islands, they planted native ahuehueted trees, which is a type of willow around the perimeters. The roots of the willow trees grew down into the lake bed, anchoring the mud and preventing the chinampa from washing away.
The sources emphasize the output of this system, and the numbers are just difficult to wrap my head around. They were pulling up to 7 crops a year out of these plots without depleting the soil. 7.
Because they were constantly dredging fresh, nutrient-rich muck from the canals and spreading it on top. It was a closed-loop system of hyperfertility. This chinampa network was feeding a sprawling urban metropolis of nearly 200,000 people.
And just like on the Salmon Coast, because the farming was so hyper-efficient, a massive portion of the Aztec population was freed up from food production. They became specialists. This is the caloric surplus that built the massive Templo Mayor pyramid. It funded the artisans who carved that 24-ton sunstone.
Right.
It allowed for a whole class of scribes to create astronomical codices to track Venus.
The cultural flowering is undeniable. But since we're looking for the shadow of abundance, we have to examine what else that mountain of maize and beans financed. And it financed a highly militarized state organized around the extraction of tribute.
Because if you have the food to feed a standing army, you can march that army to your neighbors and just demand they send you their luxury goods, their cotton, their jade, their feathers.
Yes. And crucially, that caloric surplus underwrote a state religion organized around mass human sacrifice. The cosmology dictated that the gods had sacrificed their own blood to set the sun in motion, and humans had a debt to repay to keep the universe from collapsing.
But carrying out that ritual on an industrial scale requires a massive logistical apparatus.
Exactly. It requires priests, specialized temples, obsidian blade knappers, and an army capable of constantly capturing prisoners of war to place on the altar. The chinampas provided the calories for all of it. Production, as we see, is relatively straightforward once the engineering is figured out. But distribution and the moral decision of what the surplus is commanded to do is the enduring human problem. In Tenochtitlan, the surplus fed the astronomer, but it also fed the sacrificial knife.
It seems like a surplus is almost like an amplifier. Whatever the core values of the society are, abundance just gives them the energy to do it on a massive scale.
That's a good way to put it.
Let's look at our third witness, the Andes, specifically the Muisca people, and the earlier culture of San Agustin in what is now Colombia. What did their surplus look like?
In the Andes, the geography really dictates everything. You have incredibly deep valleys and towering mountains, which creates these stacked microclimates. You can grow potatoes in the cold highlands, maize in the temperate mid-elevations, and then harvest coca and tropical fruits down in the hot valleys.
So you just trade up and down the mountain.
Exactly. By trading vertically across these ecological zones, these societies generated a deeply reliable agricultural surplus.
And at San Agustin, which was a culture that vanished long before the Spanish arrived, they directed an astonishing amount of that surplus labor into carving stone.
They carved and moved over 500 massive anthropomorphic stone giants. Some of them are incredibly terrifying with fangs and complex headdresses. They hauled these huge stones to guard their burial mounds. It was a pure diversion of caloric energy into the sacred landscape.
But I want to focus on the Muisca, who lived in the high plains around modern-day Bogota, because they took surplus labor to an entirely different medium metallurgy. They were absolute masters of a technique called lost wax casting. The sources talk about the famous Muisca raft, which is this intricate golden sculpture depicting a ritual on Lake Guatavita. Can you explain the mechanics of how you actually make something like that? Why does it prove they had so much abundance?
Well, lost wax casting is an incredibly labor-intensive, unforgiving process. An artisan begins by taking clay and sculpting the rough core shape of the object. Once that dries, they coat the clay core with a layer of beeswax. Then they meticulously carve the fine details into the wax itself. Tiny facial features, intricate headdresses, delicate woven textures.
So they're doing the actual detailed artistic sculpting in the wax itself.
Yes. Next, they take more liquid clay and carefully encase the entire wax sculpture, leaving a small channel open. They fire this whole package in a kiln. The clay hardens into a rigid mold, and the beeswax melts and runs out of the channel.
Hence the term lost wax.
Exactly. You are left with a hollow clay mold that perfectly captures the negative space of the original sculpture.
And then comes the metal.
Right. The Muisca used an alloy called tumbaga. It's a careful blend of gold and copper that actually lowers the melting point of the gold. They would pour the molten tumbaga into the channel. It fills the void left by the wax. But once it cools, there is only one way to get the golden object out.
Let me guess. You have to break it.
You have to smash the outer clay mold with a hammer.
Wow. Meaning you can never use the mold again. Every single piece is a one-off. You can't mass produce them. You have to sculpt and carve and bake an entirely new mold for every single item.
It is the ultimate display of surplus labor.
Yeah.
They had so much caloric security that they could afford to have master artisans spend hundreds of hours on a mold, only to literally smash it to pieces to retrieve the final object.
And what did they do with these incredible golden objects once they were cast? Did they hoard them as wealth?
This is where the story turns. The Muisca didn't use gold as currency or standard money. To them, gold was spiritually resonant. It was considered the sweat of the sun. The Muisca raft sculpture depicts a very real ceremony where a new leader, covered entirely in gold dust, would row out into the center of the volcanic Lake Guatavita and throw piles of these exquisitely crafted lost wax objects into the dark water as an offering to the gods. They were taking thousands of hours of specialized labor converted into tumbaga gold and just tossing it into the abyss. It's breathtaking. But the shadow here is different from the Aztecs or the Salmon Coast. It's not internal stratification, it's external vulnerability. The ritual giving of the Muisca generated a rumor. The surrounding tribes traded stories about a leader so rich he painted himself in gold and threw treasure into a lake. That rumor traveled down the mountains, through the jungles, and eventually hit the ears of the Spanish conquistadors.
The legend of El Dorado.
Exactly. The surplus they poured into the lake acted as a beacon. It pulled continental plunder, steel swords, and horrific violence right to their doorstep. The Spanish relentlessly drained lakes and destroyed communities, searching for a city of gold that didn't exist, because it was just a ritual of abundance.
Ritual offering on one side, extractive greed on the other, both orbiting the exact same metal. It really illustrates how an energy surplus, once it's transformed into a concentrated, high-value medium like gold, fundamentally alters the entire geopolitical landscape around it.
Which brings us to our fourth witness, Rapa Nui, more commonly known as Easter Island. This is the classic, almost mythical story of abundance gone wrong.
The setup is pretty famous. Polynesian voyagers sail across the vast Pacific and find this remote island with rich volcanic soil. They plant sweet potatoes, the agriculture booms, and they find themselves with so much free time that they start carving colossal stone heads out of the volcanic tuff, the moai.
The moai and the massive stone platforms they stand on, which are called ahu, represent a staggering diversion of surplus caloric energy. Different island clans engaged in competitive monumental construction, essentially using the statues to signal their power and connection to the ancestors.
Now, the shadow of Rapa Nui is so famous, it's basically a modern parable. The idea is ecocide, that they got so obsessed with building bigger and bigger statues that they chopped down every tree on the island, destroyed their environment, and starved to death. We're going to hold on the details of that for a moment because the sources contain a massive update on that story from 2024 that changes everything. But first, let's look at the fifth witness. I want to look at a living culture to prove this isn't just ancient history, the Gunana people of the San Blas Islands in Panama.
The Gunana represent a contemporary surplus culture that provides a really vital contrast. They live on an archipelago of coral islands just off the mainland. They rely on the incredibly rich marine life of the coral reefs, combined with mainland agroforestry growing plantains, coconuts, root crops.
They have a dual ecology.
Yes, and it provides them with intense caloric security and the free time to produce extraordinary art.
If you've ever seen a Guna mola, you know what we're talking about. A mola is this intricately stitched panel worn on the blouses of Guna women. It's made using a technique called reverse applique.
The mechanics of a mola are as complex as lost wax casting. Instead of sewing a patch onto the top of a fabric, a Guna artist stacks several layers of brightly colored, different cloth. Then she uses tiny scissors to cut intricate geometric patterns or animal shapes through the top layers, revealing the colors beneath.
Oh, so you cut down to the color you want.
Right, and then she folds the cut edges under and sews them down with these microscopic, invisible stitches.
It takes weeks, sometimes months, to complete a single panel. And they wear these molas alongside heavy gold nose rings and complex beaded armbands as everyday adornment. The surplus here isn't carved into a stone monument or a temple. It's stitched into cloth and worn proudly on the human body.
But the guna only exist as a vibrant surplus culture today because they made a deliberate choice. In the early 20th century, the Panamanian government looked at the guna and saw an unassimilated population. In 1919, the state enacted policies of aggressive cultural erasure. They banned the wearing of molas. They banned the gold nose rings. They sent police to enforce Western dress and outlaw traditional ceremonies.
So the shadow here was the threat of external state suppression. They had the surplus, but the state wanted to control how they lived. And the only reason we can still witness this culture today is because of the Guna Revolution of 1925.
The guna leaders secretly coordinated across the islands. They rose up, expelled the Panamanian police, violently defended their territory, and forced the government to grant them autonomy. They fought a war to defend their right to their own culture, their own surplus, and their own molas.
That is a profoundly important piece of the puzzle. So let me zoom out and look at these 5 witnesses. We have the Salmon Coast, the Aztecs, the Muisca, the Rapa Nui, and the Guna. In almost every case, when a society gets a massive winning lottery ticket of calories, the prize money ends up funding a caste system, a militarized state, or drawing in conquerors. I have to ask, is there something inherently toxic about having too much?
That specific anxiety, the fear that abundance is inherently self-limiting or destructive, isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It has actually fueled one of the oldest, most vicious, and most consequential intellectual debates in modern history.
And this is where we pivot from the historical witnesses to the theories trying to explain them. The question of whether abundance naturally hits a wall has divided thinkers for over 2 centuries. We can broadly call the first camp the pessimists, or the Malthusians. These are the folks who argue the case for hard physical limits and inevitable collapse.
Let's start with the founding father of this anxiety, the English cleric and scholar Thomas Robert Malthus. In 1798, he published a deeply influential and deeply controversial book called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus looked at the world and formulated an argument that was terrifyingly simple.
He looked at the relationship between how fast humans can make babies and how fast humans can grow food, right?
Yes. Malthus relied on a mathematical disparity. He observed that human populations, if there's plenty of food and no disease, tend to grow geometrically. 2 parents have 4 children, those 4 have 8, then 16, 32, 64.
It compounds.
The population compounds. But, he argued, our ability to increase agricultural production, to clear new fields and grow food, only increases arithmetically. 1 acre yields a certain amount, 2 acres yield twice that, 3 acres yield 3 times. It's a linear progression of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Let me try a metaphor to visualize this. It's like a train accelerating toward a bridge that is actively being built right in front of it. The train represents the human population, and every mile it travels, it doubles its speed. The bridge builders represent agriculture. They're working as hard as they can, but they can only lay down 1 fixed length of track per hour.
That is exactly the dynamic Malthus was pointing to.
So the math dictates an inevitable tragedy. No matter how much abundance you create, no matter how much of a head start the bridge builders have, the geometrically accelerating train will always, mathematically, catch up to the end of the tracks and derail.
Therefore, Malthus argued, abundance is self-erasing. If a society figures out a way to create a massive agricultural surplus, it doesn't lead to permanent leisure or a peaceful utopia.
Yeah.
The extra food simply lowers the mortality rate and encourages larger families. It creates more mouths to feed, pushing the population right back up to the absolute limit of the food supply.
And then the crash happens.
And then the natural checks engage. Famine, disease, or resource wars cull the numbers back down to what the land can temporarily support. It is the original, foundational claim that human flourishing has a hard, unbreakable physical ceiling.
Fast forward almost 2 centuries from Malthus, and that exact same anxiety gets scaled up from the local level to a planetary level by a think tank called the Club of Rome. In 1972, they published a report that absolutely shook the global consciousness. It was called The Limits to Growth.
The Club of Rome took the Malthusian intuition about limits and applied early, highly sophisticated computer modeling to it. A team of researchers from MIT built a computer model called World 3. They didn't just look at food and population like Malthus did. They recognized that modern industrial society is deeply interconnected.
They used a methodology called systems dynamics. How does that work?
Systems dynamics looks at feedback loops. If one thing changes, how does it cascade through the rest of the system? The World 3 model coupled 5 major global variables: population growth, industrial output per capita, agricultural production, the depletion of non-renewable resources like oil and minerals, and the generation of pollution.
So they feed all the historical data into the computer, hit run, and ask the machine to show them the future of human abundance. What did the model do?
They ran several scenarios, but their headline finding, the business as usual trajectory, was incredibly bleak. The model showed that as industrial output spikes, it consumes non-renewable resources at an accelerating rate. As resources get scarce, you have to divert more and more capital away from investment and into simply extracting harder-to-reach resources.
Right. Mining gets more expensive.
Exactly. And at the same time, massive industrialization generates toxic pollution, which degrades the soil, lowering agricultural yield.
So food per capita starts dropping just as the population is peaking.
Yes. The finding was that if growth continued unchecked, the global system would eventually experience what they called overshoot.
I really want to hone in on that word. Overshoot. It doesn't mean hitting a wall and instantly stopping. It's sneakier than that.
Overshoot occurs because of delays in the system's feedback loops. Imagine driving a heavy car in thick fog, but there is a 10-second delay between when you press the brake pedal and when the brakes actually engage.
Oh, that's a terrifying thought.
You see an obstacle, you press the brake, but the car keeps hurtling forward for 10 seconds. That is overshoot. By the time the negative signals, resource scarcity, dying topsoil are loud enough for the population to react, the momentum of geometric growth has already carried the population far past the carrying capacity of the environment.
And what happens when the car finally realizes it's past the edge of the cliff?
The model suggested that overshoot would lead to a sudden, uncontrollable, and steep decline in both global population and industrial capacity sometime in the mid to late 21st century. A collapse.
Now, to be fair to the sources, this report is frequently misrepresented in pop culture. People often claim the Club of Rome predicted the literal end of the world in the year 2000, which they absolutely did not do. They offered scenarios and trend lines, not fixed prophecies. But the core argument terrified people because it resonated with simple common sense. The Earth is a sphere. It is finite. You cannot have infinite physical growth on a bounded planet.
And that deeply held fear was given a very human face in 2005 by the geographer and historian Jared Diamond in his massively popular book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Diamond argued that societies that strip their environmental capital past its carrying capacity effectively choose to destroy themselves.
And his absolute favorite headline example of this Malthusian nightmare was our fourth witness, Rapa Nui, Easter Island. Let's dig into the story Diamond told, because it is the ultimate parable of ecocide.
The traditional narrative goes like this. The Polynesians arrived on a lush, heavily forested island. As their population grew, they became obsessed with the status competition of carving the moai. To move these multi-ton stone heads from the quarry to the coast, they needed timber to build rolling logs and leverage systems.
So they start cutting down the trees.
Yes. And because they are obsessed with status, they ignore the warning signs, they cut down the very last palm tree. Without forests, the rain washes the fertile topsoil into the sea, their crops fail. Without timber, they can't build canoes to fish in deep water. Starvation sets in.
Total ecosystem collapse.
The society devolves into horrific warfare and cannibalism, toppling the statues they just built. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the island was a barren grassland with a fraction of its former population.
It is such a compelling, moralistic narrative. They had abundance, they got greedy, they overshot their limits, and they collapsed. It confirms our darkest fears about our own industrial society.
It perfectly illustrates the pessimistic worldview. Ecological hubris is a fatal flaw built into human societies.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources contain research that completely shatters that narrative. We have new data from 2024, massive studies published in Science Advances in Nature that look at ancient DNA and high-resolution land use data from Rapa Nui, and the evidence simply does not support the ecocide story.
It is a profound paradigm shift. Let's look at the ancient DNA study published in Nature. Geneticists analyzed the genomes of 15 Rapa Nui individuals whose remains date to before European contact. They were looking for the genetic signature of a population collapse.
How does a population collapse show up in DNA centuries later?
It creates what geneticists call a bottleneck. Imagine a jar filled with thousands of differently colored marbles, representing high genetic diversity. If a disaster wipes out 95% of the population, it's like pouring only a handful of those marbles into a new jar.
You lose all the other colors.
Right. The new population will have drastically reduced genetic diversity, and that lack of diversity leaves a permanent, readable scar in the DNA of all future generations.
So if tens of thousands of Rapa Nui starved to death in an ecological apocalypse before 1722, the genomes of those 15 pre-contact individuals should show massive bottleneck scarring. What did the geneticists find?
They found absolutely no signature of a pre-contact population collapse. None. Instead, the genetic diversity indicated a population that was stably and steadily growing right up until European contact.
I mean, that completely flips the narrative, but what about the starvation? Did they overshoot their agricultural capacity?
That is addressed by the 2024 land use study published in Science Advances. Researchers used satellite imagery and ground truthing to map the exact extent of the island's rock gardens. Because the Rapa Nui didn't just throw seeds in the dirt, they used a sophisticated technique called lithic mulching, mixing broken volcanic rocks into the soil to retain moisture and protect crops from the wind.
The traditional ecocide theory assumed that to build all those statues, the population must have spiked to somewhere between 15 and 30,000 people before crashing.
But the new analysis of the total area of those rock gardens implies something entirely different. The researchers calculated the maximum caloric output of those gardens and concluded that the island could only ever sustainably support a peak population of around 3,000 to 4,000 people.
Which means they didn't overshoot. They mapped out their environment, figured out the carrying capacity, grew stably to about 3,000 people, and maintained that balance. So if they didn't collapse from internal ecocide, why was the population decimated by the late 19th century?
The real collapse of Rapa Nui wasn't a Malthusian ecological suicide. It was an external catastrophe caused by contact. In the 1860s, a fleet of Peruvian slave ships arrived at the island. They captured roughly 1,500 Rapa Nui, perhaps a third of the entire population, and carried them off to work in the guano mines of Peru.
Oh, that's terrible.
And the few survivors who eventually returned brought back smallpox and tuberculosis, which just ripped through the remaining population. By 1877, the population had dropped to roughly 110 people.
So the pessimist's best, most frequently cited parable of self-inflicted ecocide is historically backward. The Rapa Nui didn't choose to fail. They adapted brilliantly to a fragile environment, managed their abundance, and were violently disrupted by external forces.
This revision provides the perfect conceptual bridge to the opposing intellectual tradition. If the Malthusians and the Club of Rome are the pessimists, we now must turn to the cornucopians, the optimists who believe in human ingenuity and the expanding ceiling of abundance.
Let's bring in the defining figure of this counterargument, Esther Boserup. She was a Danish economist who published a highly influential book in 1965 called The Conditions of Agricultural Growth. She looked at Malthus and elegantly inverted his entire premise.
Malthus believed that agricultural output was the independent variable. It set a rigid ceiling and population just grew until it smacked its head against that ceiling. Boserup argued that population growth itself is the independent variable and agriculture responds to it.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. Boserup observed that when a population is small and land is incredibly abundant, people use lazy, extensive farming methods. They slash and burn a patch of forest, farm it for a year, and then leave it fallow for 20 years to recover while they move on. It's easy, but it requires vast amounts of space.
But what happens when the population grows, the land gets crowded, and they can't just move to the next valley?
That pressure, the Malthusian threat of starvation, forces them to innovate. They cannot leave the land fallow for 20 years anymore. So they invent shorter fallow periods. They invent crop rotation. To maintain fertility, they start collecting and spreading manure. When all the flat land is taken, they don't starve. They figure out how to carve massive, complex terraces into the sides of steep mountains.
Right.
For Boserup, population pressure isn't a wall that causes collapse. It is the very spur that forces a society to invent more intensive, productive technologies. The ceiling moves upward.
And that logic, that human brains are better than physical constraints, was pushed to its absolute ideological extreme by an economist named Julian Simon. Simon was arguably the most confident cornucopian of the 20th century. He famously declared that human creativity is the ultimate resource.
Simon's argument wasn't just philosophical. It was grounded in the mechanics of market economics. He observed the Malthusian fear that we are going to run out of physical resources like copper or oil or arable land. But Simon pointed out a crucial feedback loop, the price signal.
How does the price signal save us from collapse?
When a physical resource actually starts to become genuinely scarce, it gets harder to find. Because it's harder to find, it becomes more expensive. The price rises. The pessimists see that price rise is the beginning of the end, the onset of mass suffering. But Simon argued that a high price is a massive financial siren going off.
It incentivizes people.
Precisely. If copper becomes insanely expensive, three things happen simultaneously. First, mining companies suddenly have the financial incentive to invent better technologies to extract copper from lower-grade ores that were previously ignored. Second, consumers figure out ways to use copper much more efficiently. And third, and most importantly, brilliant engineers are highly motivated to invent a completely different substitute.
Because of this constant cycle of scarcity triggering a price signal, which triggers massive innovation, Simon argued that the long-run trend for humanity is actually toward more abundance, not less. We never actually hit the wall because we invented a door just before impact.
And this wasn't just a polite academic disagreement in a journal. It led to one of the most famous high-stakes wagers in the history of science.
The Simon-Ehrlich wager. On one side, you have Julian Simon, the ultimate optimist. On the other side, you have Paul Ehrlich. Ehrlich was a biologist and the author of the 1968 neo-Malthusian bestseller, The Population Bomb. Ehrlich had terrified the public by predicting that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s and 80s because the population was outrunning the food supply.
The two men despised each other's worldviews. In 1980, they formalized their dispute into a bet. Ehrlich, the pessimist who believed we were hitting hard physical limits, got to pick 5 raw materials. He chose 5 metals: copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten. The parameters were simple. They would track the inflation-adjusted prices of these 5 metals over a decade, would the prices be higher or lower in 1990.
Ehrlich's logic is straightforward. The global population is growing rapidly. More people means more demand for these finite metals. Supply goes down, demand goes up, so the prices must inevitably rise. He bet on scarcity.
Simon bet the prices would fall. He believed that over a 10-year span, the ingenuity of the market would find new reserves, create efficiencies, or substitute other materials entirely, making those specific metals relatively less important and therefore cheaper.
So a decade passes, 1990 rolls around, they check the ledgers. What happened?
Every single one of the 5 metals had fallen in price in real terms. The entire basket was down roughly 36%. Copper was replaced in telecommunications by the invention of fiber optic cables made from sand. Tin was replaced in packaging by new plastics and aluminum. Human ingenuity substituted its way out of the bottleneck. In October 1990, Paul Ehrlich had to mail Julian Simon a check for $576.07.
It is a stunning victory for the optimists. It vividly illustrates how substitution and technological efficiency can completely outrun physical depletion. When you pair the Simon-Ehrlich bet with the revisionist archaeological data from Rapa Nui, the cornucopian case looks incredibly strong. Human societies are far more resilient, adaptive, and creative than the collapse narratives suggest.
However, we need to pause here and do a rigorous neutrality check. The mission of this deep dive is to evaluate the evidence, not to crown a winner between the Malthusians and the cornucopians. We are declining to declare whether abundance inherently frees us or dooms us.
Because if we look at the honest scorecard, both camps are partly right, and both have massive blind spots. The optimists are absolutely correct that the specific apocalyptic catastrophes the pessimists constantly predict, running out of metals in the 80s, mass global starvation in the 70s, Easter Island destroying itself, they mostly did not happen because humans are incredibly good at adapting.
But the pessimists are correct that just because we haven't hit a brick wall yet doesn't mean the wall doesn't exist. Let's look at the Simon-Ehrlich bet again. It is famous, but the result flips entirely depending on which decade you pick.
Wait, really?
Yes. If Ehrlich had made the exact same bet using the exact same 5 metals, but for the decade from 2000 to 2010, Ehrlich would have won easily. During that decade, the massive, rapid industrialization of China created an overwhelming demand for raw materials that temporarily outpaced our ability to substitute or mine efficiently. Commodity prices spiked.
So a single bet over a single 10-year window doesn't disprove the existence of long-run physical limits. The Earth is still finite. The atmosphere can only absorb so much carbon before the climate destabilizes. Sinks still fill up.
The Malthusians see the planet as a fixed pie, and they worry we are running out of slices. The cornucopians see the human mind as a recipe maker that constantly figures out how to bake entirely new kinds of pies from different unthought-of ingredients.
But even if we grant the optimists their ultimate victory, even if human ingenuity allows us to keep substituting resources and producing more and more material wealth forever without destroying the planet, there is a sneaky, devastating psychological trap waiting for us. There is a mechanism by which we actively sabotage our own feeling of abundance, no matter how much we produce.
This is perhaps the sharpest and least expected shift in the entire debate about abundance. We have to move away from the physical limits of the soil and the copper and move into the cognitive realm. We need to look at the scarcity reinventors. Because suppose the factories keep churning and material abundance keeps growing. Does scarcity actually end?
No, it just migrates. It relocates to a place where technology can't solve it. Let's talk about the sociologist Thorstein Veblen. In 1899, he published a massive critique called The Theory of the Leisure Class, and he coined a term that explains so much of modern wealthy life: conspicuous consumption.
Veblen observed a fascinating shift in human behavior.
Yeah.
Once people have their basic survival needs securely met, food, shelter, warmth, they do not stop consuming. Instead, they begin to consume goods not for their actual utility, but specifically to display their social standing to others.
The classic example is a luxury watch. The entire point of a $100,000 diamond-encrusted watch is not that it tells time more accurately than a $10 digital watch. The digital watch is actually better at the core utility. The point of the diamond watch is that everyone who looks at your wrist knows you had $100,000 to burn. The wealth is displayed to signal rank.
And this idea gets supercharged in 1976 by an economist named Fred Hirsch in the book called Social Limits to Growth. Hirsch introduced an incredibly powerful concept: positional goods.
Walk me through what a positional good is and why it breaks the promise of abundance.
A positional good is something whose value is entirely dependent on its scarcity relative to others. Its worth comes from the fact that other people cannot have it. Examples include the secluded mansion on the pristine coastline, the corner office with the panoramic view, or the degree from a highly elite Ivy League university.
The crucial thing to understand about positional goods is that economic growth and technological innovation can never, ever satisfy the demand for them. As a society gets richer overall, universal material goods become incredibly cheap. Everyone gets a refrigerator, everyone gets a warm shower, everyone gets a smartphone with access to all human knowledge.
But that generalized material wealth doesn't make positional goods easier to get. It actually makes the competition for them more brutal. Because the entire value of a positional good is relative rank, it is a strict zero-sum game. You literally cannot mass-produce being in the top 1%.
Right.
If technological abundance allows everyone to get a bachelor's degree, the bachelor's degree loses its positional signaling value. The competition simply shifts. Now you need a master's degree. Then you need a doctorate from a specific prestige institution just to stand out.
Let me try to put a metaphor to this because it's so frustrating to experience. It's like being at a stadium concert. Everyone is sitting down, comfortably enjoying the music. Suddenly, one person in the front row decides to stand up to get a slightly better view, so the people directly behind them have to stand up to see. The wave ripples backward. Pretty soon, the entire stadium of 50,000 people is standing up. Now everyone's legs hurt, everyone is exhausted, and nobody can see the stage any better than when they were all comfortably sitting down.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy for positional scarcity. We spend massive amounts of energy just to maintain our relative position. And two psychologists, Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, named the internal cognitive experience of this stadium effect in 1971. They called it the hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill. How does it work in our daily lives?
It is the psychological mechanism of resetting your baseline. You tell yourself, if I just get that promotion and make 20% more money, I will finally be happy and have enough. You work furiously, you get the promotion, and you feel a brief, intense high of satisfaction. But within a few months, your brain's neurochemistry adapts. That new salary feels completely normal. Your lifestyle expands slightly, and you immediately start looking at the next promotion or the neighbor's nicer car. The target of enough keeps moving just out of reach.
When you synthesize these three concepts, Veblen's conspicuous consumption, Hirsch's positional goods, and Brickman's hedonic treadmill, you realize a terrifying truth about human nature. Economic growth feeds material wants, but it completely starves status wants. A society can solve basic survival, multiply its material goods 100-fold, completely cure physical poverty, and still feel utterly plagued by scarcity because it has quietly switched the game from having enough to live to out-having your neighbor.
And the most wild realization of this deep dive is tying this modern psychological theory back to our ancient witnesses. This isn't a new phenomenon caused by Instagram or modern capitalism. Think back to the Salmon Coast.
The potlatch.
Yes, the potlatch was the original ultimate status arms race. They had mountains of smoked salmon. Calorie starvation was not their problem. Their physical needs were met. But they still fought fiercely, sometimes violently, over prestige, destroying perfectly good blankets and copper shields just to prove their superior rank. They successfully manufactured a bitter scarcity of status out of a sheer abundance of fish.
Which brings us to the most vital question of the entire discussion. If abundance doesn't naturally end scarcity, but merely relocates it to the realm of status and positional goods, what happens when a society is forced to decide who actually gets access to the surplus? Why can't we just agree to share it equally?
To answer that, we have to look at the anthropology of equality versus hierarchy. There is a romantic assumption that if we just make enough stuff, everyone will naturally relax and be equal. But the historical data says something very different.
For a long time, anthropologists noted that small nomadic foraging bands were often highly egalitarian. Everyone shared the food. But recent work has stressed that this equality was not due to some innate human virtue or a lack of greed, right?
Correct. The equality in those nomadic bands was actively enforced. They vigorously policed each other. If a single hunter brought down a large animal, social norms dictated that he could not claim ownership of the meat. Through constant teasing, public shaming, and strict leveling mechanisms, the group ensured that no single individual could hoard the caloric surplus or elevate themselves above the others.
What happens the moment those social constraints are lifted, or the ecology changes?
What's fascinating here is a major 2021 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It provides the answer. Researchers looked at ecological variation and institutionalized inequality across diverse hunter-gatherer societies. They found a striking, undeniable correlation.
They found that institutionalized inequality, hereditary rank, and slavery tend to emerge precisely in environments where resources are dense, predictable, and defensible.
Yes, let's break those three words down. When an energy surplus is scattered and unpredictable like hunting herds that move erratically across a vast plain, you cannot monopolize it. You can't build a fence around a migrating herd. But when abundance is clumped together, when 1 million salmon predictably swim up a narrow, specific river every single October, that concentration is defensible. A single family or clan can build a physical fence across the river, claim absolute ownership of the bottleneck, and use that immense surplus to buy guards, build monuments, and subjugate everyone else who needs the food.
Abundance in this light is actually the solvent of equality. When surplus concentrates, that concentration buys hierarchy. This completely changes how I view history. It means looking back and asking, did they have enough? It's fundamentally the wrong question.
There was more than enough food in the Chinampas of Tenochtitlan. Yet they maintained a brutal tribute system and ritually sacrificed thousands of people. There was enough salmon on the coast, yet a quarter of the population was enslaved. The binding question is never the sheer mathematical size of the surplus. The binding question is, who gets to decide what the surplus is commanded to do? Who controls the distribution?
And this is where the Gunna people of Panama serve as such a vital, necessary counterexample. They had a comparable ecological surplus from the reefs and the forest. They had the caloric security and the free time to make the incredibly complex molas and the gold jewelry. But they maintained a fiercely defended equality and autonomy. They didn't build a massive slave state.
Because they actively, consciously fought for equality. Abundance merely creates the possibility of stratification. It provides the raw, energetic material. But it is politics, culture, and human choice that decide whether that stratification is realized or resisted. The Guna chose to organize a revolution, expel the police, and defend their egalitarian structure against a Panamanian state that wanted to assimilate and control them. Equality requires effort.
So if we synthesize everything so far, we have physical limits that are real, but human ingenuity that is also remarkably real. And we have the undeniable historical fact that a surplus that exists is never automatically a surplus that is shared. Now, we need to bring all of these ancient lessons crashing into the present moment, because we are hearing the echoes of these historical choices all around us today.
We're currently standing on the precipice of massive technological promises regarding a new, unprecedented era of global abundance.
It's the modern equivalent of discovering the ultimate salmon run or inventing a digital chinampa. Tech CEOs and energy leaders are loudly telling us that artificial intelligence, coupled with near-limitless clean energy like next-generation solar or nuclear fusion, is going to solve survival for the entire planet once and for all.
The optimistic vision being sold is intoxicating. It is a literal post-scarcity utopia. They propose that AI and advanced robotics will eventually handle all physical and cognitive labor. This will lead to policies like universal basic income, creating what some theorists call fully automated luxury. In this vision, we won't need to work for wages, and the economy will transition to one based on reputation, creativity, and gifting.
Almost like a frictionless digital potlatch.
Exactly.
Sounds beautiful. But our historical witnesses demand that we vigorously test this promise against reality. First, there's a physical catch. We have to look at the energy required to run this utopia. AI's energy appetite is massive, and it is growing at a staggering geometric rate.
The sources provide the data. Data center electricity consumption globally was around 460 terawatt-hours in 2024. But projections suggest that as AI scales, that usage could skyrocket to over 1,300 terawatt-hours by 2035. We are building the brain, but the brain requires immense amounts of electricity.
And the tech leaders say, don't worry, AI will make our energy grid so hyper-efficient that it will balance out. But here we run into a fascinating economic concept from 1865, articulated by a man named Stanley Jevons, the Jevons paradox.
Jevons was an economist looking at coal consumption during the Industrial Revolution. He noticed something totally counterintuitive. As engineers like James Watt made steam engines much more efficient at burning coal, society didn't use less coal overall.
We use drastically more coal. Why does efficiency increase consumption?
Because efficiency makes the technology cheaper and more profitable to operate. If a steam engine is wildly inefficient and expensive to run, only a few wealthy factory owners will buy one. But if you make it hyper-efficient and cheap to run, suddenly everyone builds a factory. They put steam engines on boats. They put them on trains. The Jevons paradox warns us that increasing the efficiency of a resource lowers its cost, which paradoxically raises the total overall consumption.
So apply that to AI and energy. If AI makes energy use hyper-efficient, we might not just coast into a low-energy utopia. We might just invent 10,000 brand new, highly profitable ways to consume energy, outrunning even the massive gains of solar or fusion power. We might Jevons paradox our way right back to the brink of Malthusian limits.
And then, even if we solve the energy equation, we face the psychological test. Even if AI provides limitless material goods, if it can 3D print you any object you want for free, it cannot solve positional scarcity.
Right. And AI cannot mass-produce the status of being the CEO or the prestige of living in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. As our material needs are completely met by automation, the brutal stadium seating competition for positional goods and social status will likely only intensify.
Which brings us to the live political debate happening right now in 2025. We need to look at the arguments presented by commentators like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in their book, simply titled Abundance. And remember, we are presenting this neutrally as one distinct perspective in an ongoing, complex debate.
Their core argument is that in the modern wealthy world, scarcity isn't always a physical reality imposed by nature. It is often a chosen, governance-made failure.
They posit that the real fight today isn't against Malthusian physical limits. We have the technology to generate clean energy and build dense housing. The fight is against our own regulatory, legal, and political structures. They ask, will we, as a society, allow ourselves to build the massive infrastructure, the vast new transmission grids, the high-density urban housing required to actually distribute this abundance? Or will we use zoning laws and endless environmental reviews to protect the positional goods of the people who already own property?
If we connect all these historical and modern dots, the grand synthesis of this deep dive leaves us staring at a profound, unresolved question. Will the AI revolution and limitless energy lead to a shared, egalitarian utopia? Or will we slam headfirst into the Jevons paradox, hit physical limits we thought we outsmarted, and drown in a sea of manufactured positional scarcity, ultimately creating a new, hyper-stratified technobility that resembles the slave-holding elites of the Salmon Coast?
History suggests that the technology itself is incapable of deciding for us. The surplus, whether it's millions of smoked salmon, towering chinampas, or terawatts of server power, is morally neutral. It just provides the raw, energetic material.
So what does this all mean? It means we must decline the easy, comforting verdict. Abundance does not automatically free us into a utopia, and it does not inevitably doom us to collapse. Both the pessimists and the optimists capture a piece of the truth. The physical limits of our planet are real. The boundless capacity of human ingenuity to adapt is also real. But the most important, enduring truth we've uncovered today is that a surplus that exists is never a surplus that is automatically shared.
Every single society we've cross-examined, the carvers on the rainy coast, the astronomers in the floating city of Tenochtitlan, the goldsmiths in the high Andes, the monument builders of Rapa Nui, the weavers of the Sandbloss Islands, every single society that solved the math of basic survival then had to wake up the next morning, look at each other, and decide what the leftover hours were for.
Yeah. That moral choice, that is the whole story. And that is exactly where I want to leave you, the listener. Think about your own life. Think about those rare moments when you finally get a raise at work, or you buy a new piece of software that promises to save you 3 hours a week. What do you actually do with that newly minted surplus time? Do you build your own equivalent of a totem pole or a beautifully stitched mola? Do you invest it in your community, in art, in simply resting? Or do you just find a new, faster treadmill to run on, chasing a status or a scarcity that you manufactured entirely yourself? Because if the next era of human history is about to hand us the greatest energy and technological surplus we've ever seen, the monuments we build next won't be limited by our calories. They'll be limited by our character. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.